Hello, friends, and welcome to a story that will stir your hearts and ignite your spirits, a tale of courage, truth, and the unbreakable bond between a father and son. Picture a courtroom in the heart of a bustling American city, its polished wood and solemn air heavy with anticipation. The room buzzes with whispers, a collective breath held as justice teeters on a knife's edge. At the center stands a young man, Marcus Carter, just 17 years old, his dark eyes steady despite the storm brewing around him. Moments ago, a sharp crack shattered the courtroom's decorum. A uniformed officer, Richard Hayes, struck Marcus across the face. The slap echoed like thunder, a blatant act of aggression cloaked in authority. Gasps rippled through the spectators, their faces a mosaic of shock and outrage. Marcus, however, didn't flinch. His cheek bloomed red, but his gaze remained unyielding, a silent rebuke that cut deeper than words. This wasn't just a moment of violence, it was a spark, a flare illuminating the shadows of a system long overdue for reckoning. The officer, broad-shouldered and stern, stood unapologetic, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. To him, Marcus was a challenge to his control, a young black teen whose mere presence in this courtroom seemed to unsettle his sense of power. But Marcus wasn't here by chance. He was a defendant in a minor case, a misunderstanding over a curfew violation that had spiraled into something far larger. The slap wasn't about the case, it was about dominance, a desperate attempt to silence a voice that refused to be cowed. Around Marcus, the courtroom came alive with murmurs. A woman in the third row clutched her purse, her voice low but fierce. "That boy didn't deserve that," she whispered to her neighbor, who nodded, eyes blazing. Across the aisle, a young man scribbled notes, his pen scratching furiously as if to capture the injustice before it could be swept away. The air crackled with unspoken questions. How could this happen? Who would stand against it? Marcus's composure was a quiet storm, a testament to a strength forged in the crucible of a world that often judged him before knowing him. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where trust in authority was scarce, where every interaction with law enforcement carried a weight of suspicion. Yet he stood tall, his silence louder than any protest, a beacon of dignity in a room teetering on the edge of chaos. As the whispers grew, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the crowd. A man entered, his presence commanding without effort. This was James Carter, Marcus's father, a 42-year-old man whose steady gait and piercing gaze spoke of a life spent navigating unseen battles. Dressed in a tailored suit, he moved with the quiet authority of someone who knew the cost of truth. James wasn't just a father. Unbeknownst to most in the room, he was an undercover FBI agent, a man who had spent decades unraveling corruption and deceit in the shadows. His work had taken him to places where justice was a distant dream, yet his heart remained tethered to his son, the reason he fought so fiercely for a better world. As he crossed the courtroom, his eyes locked on Marcus, a silent promise passing between them, "You are not alone." The judge, a seasoned woman named Eleanor Grayson, adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable but attentive. She sensed the shift in the room, the way James's arrival seemed to recalibrate the balance of power. The officer, Hayes, shifted uncomfortably, a bead of sweat betraying his bravado. For the first time, his authority felt fragile, exposed under the weight of a father's gaze. James stopped near the front, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Can someone explain why a man sworn to protect feels entitled to harm a boy seeking justice?" His words were calm but weighted, each syllable a challenge to the room's conscience. The question hung in the air, a call to action that demanded more than silence. In that moment, the courtroom became more than a place of law, it was a stage for truth, a crucible where justice, dignity, and unity would be tested. Marcus stood at its heart, his defiance a spark that promised to ignite a fire. And James, his father, was the steady hand ready to guide that flame toward change. The courtroom simmered, the echo of James Carter's question lingering like a challenge no one dared answer. Officer Richard Hayes stood rigid, his jaw tight, but his eyes flickered with unease. The spectators, a diverse tapestry of faces, young and old, hopeful and weary, leaned forward, their whispers weaving a chorus of dissent. This wasn't just about a slap anymore, it was about what that act represented, a fracture in the facade of justice that demanded repair. Marcus Carter, still standing beside his attorney, felt the weight of every gaze. At 17, he was no stranger to scrutiny, but this was different. The courtroom saw him not as a statistic or a stereotype, but as a young man whose resilience spoke louder than the violence inflicted upon him. His silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy, a refusal to let anger define him. His mother had taught him that, before she passed, she'd instilled in him a belief that dignity was a shield stronger than any fist. James, positioned near the front, surveyed the room with the precision of a man trained to read truths hidden in plain sight. His years in the FBI had honed his instincts, teaching him to see the cracks in systems that others accepted as unassailable. He knew Officer Hayes wasn't just an individual but a symptom of a deeper malaise, a culture that too often shielded misconduct under the guise of order. Today, that shield would crack. The defense attorney, a wiry man named Leonard Walsh, cleared his throat, attempting to steer the proceedings back to protocol. Your Honor, we're here to address a curfew violation, not to sensationalize an officer's reaction to a tense situation, he said, his voice steady but hollow. A murmur of disapproval rose from the gallery, swift and sharp. A woman in the back, her voice carrying, muttered, "Tense? That was a crime." Judge Grayson's gavel tapped lightly, restoring order, but her eyes left Walsh's. "Mr. Walsh, the court is well aware of the incident that just occurred. We will address all relevant matters," she said, her tone leaving no room for deflection. Her gaze shifted to James, a silent invitation to continue. James stepped forward, his presence a quiet force that commanded attention. "Your Honor, my son stands here because he believes in right and wrong, even when the world tries to blur that line," he began. "Today, he's been met with violence instead of fairness. I ask this court, and everyone here, to recognize what's at stake, not just one boy's future, but the soul of our justice." His words landed like stones in still water, building through ripples the crowd. A young woman in the jury box, her expression thoughtful, jotted notes, her pen a quiet ally in this pursuit of truth. An older juror, his face etched with years of experience, nodded slightly, as if James had voiced a truth he'd long felt but never articulated. The room was waking up, each person grappling with their role in this moment. Officer Hayes, under the weight of James's words, felt the ground shift. His badge, once a symbol of unquestioned power, now felt like a target. He'd acted on impulse, believing his authority would silence dissent, but now he faced a room united by outrage. A memory surfaced, his early days on the force, when he'd sworn to protect, not to harm. Had he strayed so far from that oath? The prosecutor, a determined woman named Clara Bennett, rose, sensing the moment's gravity. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests an immediate inquiry into Officer Hayes's conduct," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "This incident isn't isolated, it's part of a pattern we intend to explore." Her words hinted at evidence yet to come, a promise of truths waiting to be unveiled. The gallery stirred, a murmur of anticipation. A man in the second row, his voice low, whispered to his companion, "This is about time. How many more like him are out there?" His words echoed a sentiment that was taking root, a demand for accountability that transcended this one case. The courtroom was no longer a passive observer, it was a community bound by a shared hunger for justice. Marcus watched, his heart steady but heavy. He'd entered this room expecting judgment, but he was finding something else, solidarity. The faces around him, his father's resolve, the jurors' attention, the spectators' quiet strength, told him he wasn't alone. This fight was theirs, too, a collective stand for dignity and fairness. As the proceedings paused for a brief recess, James placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that spoke of love and strength. "You're stronger than they know," he said softly. Marcus nodded, his eyes meeting his father's, a silent vow to carry on. Together, they stood ready to face the truths that would unfold, knowing that each step toward justice was a step toward a world where no one had to stand alone. The recess ended, and the courtroom reconvened, its energy sharper now, as if honed by the truths already spoken. Marcus Carter stood resolute, his presence a quiet challenge to the officer who'd struck him. The red mark on his cheek had faded, but the memory of that act burned bright, fueling the room's collective conscience. This was no longer about a single moment, it was about dismantling a narrative that had allowed such a moment to occur. James Carter, the father whose arrival had shifted the trial's trajectory, sat beside Marcus, his eyes scanning the room with the vigilance of a man who'd spent his life deciphering lies. His FBI training had taught him to see patterns where others overlooked, to uncover truths buried under layers of denial. Today, those skills were personal, every instinct focused on protecting his son and exposing the system that had emboldened Officer Richard Hayes. Clara Bennett, the prosecutor, took the floor, her briefcase brimming with evidence she'd compiled over weeks of investigation. "Your Honor," she began, her voice commanding attention, "the prosecution will present evidence demonstrating that Officer Hayes's actions are part of a documented history of misconduct." She held up a folder, its contents a damning chronicle of complaints, unheeded, dismissed, buried. The gallery leaned in, a collective intake of breath. A woman in the front row, her face lined with years of advocacy, whispered, "Finally, someone's shining a light." Her words captured the room's mood, a hunger for truth, a refusal to let this moment pass without consequence. Judge Grayson nodded, her expression neutral but her eyes keen, signaling Clara to proceed. Clara called her first witness, a former colleague of Hayes named Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 30s whose nervous demeanor belied her resolve. Sarah took the stand, her hands clasped tightly. "I've worked with Officer Hayes for years," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I've seen him use force when words would have sufficed, target young men like Marcus without cause. It wasn't just one day, it was a pattern." The courtroom absorbed her words, each one a chisel striking at Hayes's facade. Jurors scribbled notes, their faces a mix of shock and recognition. A young man in the gallery, his expression fierce, murmured to his friend, "That's what we've been saying for years." His voice was low, but it carried the weight of a community too long ignored. Hayes sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the table before him. Sarah's testimony was a mirror he couldn't avoid, reflecting actions he'd justified as necessary. A memory flickered, complaints filed against him, brushed aside by superiors who valued order over justice. Had he believed those excuses, or had he simply accepted them? James watched Sarah, noting the courage it took to speak against a system that rewarded silence. He'd faced similar choices in his career, moments where truth clashed with loyalty. Each time, he'd chosen the former, a path that had led him here, standing with his son. Marcus, listening to Sarah, felt a surge of validation. Her words weren't just about Hayes, they were about every encounter he'd endured, every glance that judged him before he spoke. Clara presented documents, incident reports, citizen complaints, internal memos, all painting a picture of an officer unchecked by accountability. "These records show a history of excessive force," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "They show a system that failed to act, allowing Officer Hayes to escalate until this moment." The defense, led by Leonard Walsh, scrambled to respond. "Your Honor, these are isolated incidents, taken out of context," he argued, but his words lacked conviction. The gallery's murmurs grew louder, a tide of dissent that drowned his deflections. Judge Grayson raised a hand, silencing the room. "Mr. Walsh, you'll have your chance to respond," she said. "Let's hear the evidence." As Clara continued, the courtroom became a crucible, each revelation forging a stronger demand for justice. Spectators exchanged glances, their shared outrage building a bridge across divides. A man in the back, his voice quiet but firm, said to his neighbor, "This isn't just about Marcus, it's about all of us." His words echoed James's earlier challenge, a call to recognize the stakes. Marcus stood taller, his silence a powerful ally. He wasn't just a defendant, he was a symbol of resilience, a young man whose dignity refused to be stripped away. James, beside him, felt a swell of pride. This fight was theirs, but it belonged to everyone in this room, a collective stand for a justice that upheld the powerless as fiercely as the powerful. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, the courtroom buzzed with a new energy, a resolve to see this through, to ensure that truth didn't end with words but sparked action. Marcus and James shared a look, a silent vow to carry on, knowing that each step toward justice was a step toward a world where dignity reigned supreme. The courtroom doors swung open, admitting a fresh wave of spectators as the trial resumed. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable sense that each moment brought the pursuit of justice closer to a tipping point. Marcus Carter, 17, stood beside his attorney, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of revelations. The red mark from Officer Richard Hayes's slap had faded, but its impact lingered, fueling a collective resolve to confront the truths laid bare. James Carter, Marcus's father and an undercover FBI agent, sat with a steady gaze, his years of navigating deception sharpening his focus. The testimony of Sarah Mitchell, Hayes's former colleague, had cracked the officer's armor, exposing a history of unchecked misconduct. Now, the prosecution, led by Clara Bennett, prepared to amplify voices too long silenced, weaving a narrative that transcended Marcus's case to indict a flawed system. Clara called her next witness, Evelyn Torres, a 45-year-old community organizer whose warm demeanor belied a fierce commitment to justice. Evelyn took the stand, her eyes sweeping the room, connecting with spectators who saw their own struggles reflected in her. "I've lived in this city my whole life," she began, her voice rich with conviction. "I've seen young people like Marcus stopped, questioned, judged, not for what they've done, but for who they are." Her words struck a chord, ripples of agreement spreading through the gallery. A young woman in the second row nodded, her hands clasped tightly, as if Evelyn had voiced her own unspoken fears. Evelyn recounted incidents, teenagers harassed, families intimidated, complaints ignored, each a thread in a tapestry of systemic bias. "We've been shouting into the void," she said, "but today, this courtroom is listening." Marcus listened, his heart swelling with recognition. Evelyn's stories echoed his own, late-night walks interrupted by flashing lights, questions laced with suspicion. Yet her presence on the stand transformed those moments from isolated wounds into a shared call for change. He glanced at James, whose subtle nod conveyed pride and solidarity, a reminder that this fight was bigger than them. Clara presented a series of community petitions, documents signed by hundreds demanding reform in policing practices. "These aren't just signatures," she said, holding them aloft. "They're the voices of a community tired of being unheard." The jurors, a diverse group reflecting the city's mosaic, leaned forward, their expressions a mix of empathy and resolve. An older juror, his face weathered, scribbled notes, his pen a quiet commitment to weigh each word. Officer Hayes sat stiffly, his earlier defiance eroded by the mounting evidence. Evelyn's testimony wasn't just about him, it was about a culture that had enabled his actions, a system that turned a blind eye to injustice. A memory surfaced, a training session years ago, where de-escalation was preached but rarely practiced. Had he ignored those lessons, or had the system failed to enforce them? The defense attorney, Leonard Walsh, rose to cross-examine, his tone measured but strained. "Ms. Torres, aren't these incidents you describe often complex, requiring split-second decisions?" he asked. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "Complexity doesn't justify harm," she replied. "It demands accountability." A murmur of approval swept the gallery, a chorus of voices refusing to be silenced. Judge Eleanor Grayson maintained order, her gavel a gentle tap, but her eyes betrayed a recognition of the moment's weight. This trial was no longer about a single act, it was a referendum on justice itself. Spectators exchanged glances, their shared outrage forging bonds across divides. A man in the back, his voice low, whispered, "She's speaking for all of us." His words captured the room's spirit, a unity born of shared struggle. As Evelyn stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with energy, a collective resolve to see this through. Marcus stood taller, his silence a powerful ally, amplifying the voices that rose in his defense. James, beside him, felt the tide turning, a shift toward a justice that honored the dignity of every person in this room. Together, they braced for the next chapter, knowing that each truth uncovered was a step toward change. The courtroom's energy crackled as the trial pressed forward, each testimony building a bridge between individual pain and collective action. Marcus Carter, the young man at the heart of this storm, stood with quiet strength, his presence a reminder of the stakes. The slap from Officer Richard Hayes had sparked a fire, and now, with the prosecution's case gaining momentum, that fire threatened to consume the illusions of an unaccountable system. James Carter, Marcus's father, watched the proceedings with a steely focus, his FBI training attuned to the subtle shifts in the room. Clara Bennett, the prosecutor, had just called a new witness, Jamal Robinson, a 28-year-old activist whose fiery passion had galvanized protests across the city. Jamal took the stand, his dreadlocks pulled back, his eyes blazing with purpose. "This isn't just about Marcus," Jamal began, his voice resonant, cutting through the room's hush. "It's about every kid stopped on their way home, every parent who fears for their child's safety. We've marched, we've shouted, and now we're here, demanding change." His words were a rallying cry, igniting nods and murmurs from the gallery. A young man in the front row clenched his fist, his expression fierce, as if Jamal had given voice to his own resolve. Jamal recounted organizing efforts, rallies, petitions, community forums, all born from incidents like Marcus's, moments where authority overstepped into oppression. "We're not asking for favors," he said. "We're demanding what's right, a system that serves everyone, not just a few." His testimony wove personal stories with broader truths, painting a picture of a community united by a shared vision of justice. Clara displayed photos from protests, images of diverse crowds holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "End systemic bias." "These are the faces of change," she said, her voice steady. "They're here, in this courtroom, through Mr. Robinson's words." The jurors absorbed the images, their faces reflecting a dawning awareness of their role in this larger movement. A woman juror, her expression thoughtful, nodded slightly, her pen pausing as she processed the weight of the moment. Officer Hayes felt the room's energy shift against him. Jamal's words weren't just testimony, they were a mirror reflecting a truth he'd avoided, that his actions were part of a pattern, not an anomaly. A memory flickered, a protest he'd policed, faces in the crowd staring back with defiance. Had he dismissed them as troublemakers, or had he failed to see their humanity? Leonard Walsh, the defense attorney, attempted to counter. "Mr. Robinson, isn't it true that protests can escalate, requiring police to maintain order?" he asked. Jamal leaned forward, unflinching. "Order at the cost of justice isn't order, it's control," he replied. The gallery erupted in murmurs, a tide of agreement that Walsh couldn't stem. Judge Grayson's gavel restored calm, but the room's spirit was unyielding. James watched Jamal, recognizing a kindred spirit, a man who, like him, had chosen to fight for truth despite the cost. His FBI work had often been solitary, but here, in this courtroom, he saw a community rising together, their voices a chorus stronger than any individual effort. Marcus, beside him, felt the swell of support, his silence amplifying the power of those who spoke for him. This wasn't just his fight, it was theirs. As Jamal stepped down, the courtroom pulsed with a newfound unity. Spectators shared nods, their differences fading in the face of a common cause. A woman in the third row whispered, "He's right, we're stronger together." Her words echoed the room's transformation, from a place of judgment to a crucible of collective action. Marcus and James stood ready, their bond a beacon, as the trial moved toward its next revelation. The courtroom's atmosphere was electric, a charged space where each word carried the weight of history and hope. Marcus Carter, the 17-year-old whose defiance had sparked this trial, stood as a symbol of resilience, his silence a powerful counterpoint to the voices rising in his defense. The prosecution's case, led by Clara Bennett, had exposed Officer Richard Hayes's misconduct as part of a systemic failure, and now, the narrative was poised to deepen. James Carter, Marcus's father, sat with a quiet intensity, his FBI-honed instinct sensing a pivotal moment. Clara called her next witness, Dr. Anita Patel, a 40-year-old sociologist whose expertise in systemic bias had shaped national conversations. Dr. Patel took the stand, her presence calm but commanding, her glasses reflecting the courtroom's lights as she prepared to unveil uncomfortable truths. "We're here to discuss more than one man's actions," Dr. Patel began, her voice clear and measured. "We're confronting a system that enables those actions, a structure built on biases that harm communities like Marcus's." She presented data, statistics on disproportionate policing, studies on implicit bias, histories of unaddressed complaints, each fact a brick in a wall of undeniable truth. The jurors leaned forward, their notebooks filling with notes. A young juror, his brow furrowed, seemed to wrestle with the implications, his pen pausing as Dr. Patel's words sank in. She spoke of cycles, how unchecked power led to abuse, how silence perpetuated harm. "This isn't new," she said. "It's a pattern, one we can break if we choose accountability over apathy." The gallery absorbed her words, a murmur of recognition spreading. A man in the back, his voice low, whispered to his companion, "She's laying it all bare." His words captured the room's mood, a collective awakening to truths long ignored. Marcus listened, his heart steady but heavy. Dr. Patel's testimony validated his experiences, transforming personal pain into a broader call for reform. Officer Hayes sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. Dr. Patel's words were a mirror he couldn't escape, reflecting not just his actions but the system that had shaped them. A memory surfaced, an early reprimand for excessive force, dismissed with a warning. Had that moment set him on this path, or had the system's leniency paved the way? Leonard Walsh rose to cross-examine, his voice strained. "Dr. Patel, isn't it true that individual officers face unique pressures, not always reflective of systemic issues?" he asked. Dr. Patel's gaze was unflinching. "Pressures don't excuse patterns," she replied. "They demand we address the root causes." The gallery murmured in agreement, a tide of support that Walsh couldn't counter. Judge Grayson maintained order, her expression neutral but her eyes attentive, recognizing the trial's broader stakes. This was a moment of reckoning, a chance to confront truths that extended beyond these walls. Spectators shared glances, their unity strengthening with each revelation. A woman in the front row whispered, "This is about our future." Her words echoed James's mission, a fight for a world where dignity was universal. As Dr. Patel stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with resolve. Marcus stood resolute, his silence a testament to his strength, amplifying the truths spoken in his defense. James, beside him, felt the narrative shifting, a movement toward a justice that honored every voice. Together, they prepared for the next chapter, knowing that each truth uncovered was a step toward a brighter, fairer world. The courtroom pulsed with a quiet intensity as the trial entered its next phase, each moment a step closer to a reckoning. Marcus Carter, the 17-year-old whose resilience had ignited this pursuit of justice, stood steadfast, his presence a beacon of dignity amidst the storm of revelations. The slap from Officer Richard Hayes had sparked a fire, and now, with the prosecution's case building an unassailable narrative, that fire threatened to reshape the foundations of justice itself. James Carter, Marcus's father and an undercover FBI agent, watched with a honed focus, his years of unraveling deceit sharpening his sense of the room's shifting dynamics. Clara Bennett, the prosecutor, had just called a new witness, Malik Johnson, a 32-year-old former police officer who had left the force after witnessing its flaws firsthand. Malik took the stand, his broad frame tense but his voice steady, carrying the weight of truths he'd carried in silence for too long. "I joined the force to make a difference," Malik began, his eyes meeting those of the jurors. "But I saw things, patterns of bias, unchecked aggression, that made me question what I was part of." He recounted incidents involving Officer Hayes, moments where protocol was twisted to justify force, where complaints from communities like Marcus's were dismissed as noise. "I stayed quiet too long," he admitted. "But I'm here now, because silence isn't an option anymore." The gallery absorbed his words, a ripple of recognition spreading. A woman in the fourth row, her face etched with years of advocacy, nodded fiercely, her hands clasped as if to hold on to Malik's courage. His testimony wasn't just about Hayes, it was about a culture that rewarded loyalty over integrity, a system that failed those it swore to protect. Marcus listened, his heart swelling with validation. Malik's words echoed his own experiences, encounters where his humanity was secondary to suspicion. Clara presented internal memos, documents Malik had provided, detailing ignored complaints and hushed investigations. "These papers show a system that protected Officer Hayes," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "They show why we're here today." The jurors, their faces a tapestry of empathy and resolve, scribbled notes. A young juror, her expression fierce, seemed to internalize each word, her pen a quiet ally in this fight for truth. Officer Hayes sat rigid, his eyes avoiding Malik's. The testimony was a mirror reflecting choices he'd made, moments where he'd leaned on authority rather than accountability. A memory surfaced, a late-night incident, a young man not unlike Marcus, a warning from a superior to handle it quietly. Had he followed orders, or had he chosen to? Leonard Walsh, the defense attorney, rose to cross-examine, his tone defensive. "Mr. Johnson, isn't it possible your perspective is colored by personal grievances with the department?" he asked. Malik's gaze didn't waver. "My grievance is with injustice," he replied. "I saw it, and I won't pretend otherwise." The gallery murmured in approval, a tide of support that Walsh couldn't stem. Judge Eleanor Grayson tapped her gavel, restoring order, but the room's spirit was unyielding. James watched Malik, recognizing a man who, like him, had faced the cost of truth. His FBI work had taught him the power of breaking silence, and here, in this courtroom, he saw that power take root. Marcus, beside him, felt the weight of Malik's words, his silence amplifying the courage of those who spoke for him. This was no longer just his story, it was a movement, a collective stand for dignity and fairness. As Malik stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with resolve. Spectators shared nods, their unity strengthening with each truth uncovered. A man in the back whispered, "He's one of us now." His words captured the room's transformation, a space where courage forged bonds across divides. Marcus and James stood ready, their bond a beacon, as the trial moved toward its next revelation. The courtroom's energy was a living thing, a current of hope and determination that surged with each new voice. Marcus Carter, the young man whose defiance had set this trial in motion, stood as a symbol of resilience, his silence a powerful counterpoint to the chorus of testimonies. The prosecution's case, led by Clara Bennett, had exposed Officer Richard Hayes's actions as part of a systemic failure, and now, the narrative deepened, drawing in the community that had rallied behind Marcus. James Carter, Marcus's father, sat with a quiet intensity, his FBI training attuning him to the room's collective pulse. Clara called her next witness, Rosa Nguyen, a 50-year-old small business owner whose corner store was a hub of neighborhood life. Rosa took the stand, her presence warm but resolute, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of witnessing her community's struggles and triumphs. "This city is my home," Rosa began, her voice steady, laced with a soft accent. "I've seen kids like Marcus grow up, full of dreams, only to face suspicion instead of support." She spoke of incidents, young people stopped outside her store, harassed without cause, their stories echoing Marcus's. "We've lost trust," she said. "But we're here to rebuild it, starting with the truth." Her words resonated, a murmur of agreement spreading through the gallery. A young man in the third row, his expression fierce, nodded, as if Rosa had voiced his own frustrations. She recounted community efforts, meetings, petitions, vigils, born from moments like Marcus's, a collective demand for change. "We're not just fighting for one boy," she said. "We're fighting for our future." Clara displayed letters from community members, each a testament to the impact of unchecked policing. "These are the voices of a city," she said, holding them aloft. "They demand justice, not just for Marcus, but for all." The jurors, their faces reflecting the city's diversity, leaned forward, their pens capturing the weight of Rosa's words. An older juror, his expression thoughtful, seemed to wrestle with the broader implications, his notes a quiet commitment to justice. Officer Hayes felt the room's unity press against him. Rosa's testimony wasn't just about him, it was about a community he'd failed to serve, a trust he'd broken. A memory flickered, a night outside Rosa's store, a teenager questioned harshly, her disapproving gaze from the doorway. Had he ignored her judgment, or had he never seen it? Leonard Walsh rose, his voice strained. "Ms. Nguyen, aren't these incidents often misunderstandings, not malice?" he asked. Rosa's eyes narrowed. "Misunderstandings don't leave scars," she replied. "Neglect does." The gallery erupted in murmurs, a tide of support that Walsh couldn't counter. Judge Grayson restored calm, her eyes acknowledging the moment's gravity. James watched Rosa, seeing a reflection of his own mission, to protect communities, not divide them. His FBI work had often been solitary, but here, he saw a city rising together, their voices a chorus of change. Marcus, beside him, felt the swell of support, his silence amplifying Rosa's words. This was a fight for every kid who'd walked his path, a stand for dignity and unity. As Rosa stepped down, the courtroom vibrated with purpose. Spectators shared glances, their bonds forged in shared struggle. A woman in the front row whispered, "She's our voice." Her words captured the room's spirit, a community united, ready to shape a just future. Marcus and James stood resolute, their mission clear, as the trial pressed toward its climax. The courtroom was a crucible, its air heavy with the weight of truths unveiled and the promise of justice on the horizon. Marcus Carter, the 17-year-old whose courage had sparked this trial, stood as a pillar of dignity, his silence a testament to a strength that refused to be broken. The prosecution's case, led by Clara Bennett, had woven a damning narrative, exposing Officer Richard Hayes's actions as a symptom of systemic rot, and now, the trial neared a pivotal moment. James Carter, Marcus's father, watched with a steely resolve, his FBI instinct sensing the narrative's crescendo. Clara called her final witness, Detective Carla Evans, a 40-year-old internal affairs investigator whose meticulous work had uncovered Hayes's hidden history. Carla took the stand, her presence calm but unyielding, her notebook a chronicle of truths long buried. "I've investigated Officer Hayes for years," Carla began, her voice precise, cutting through the room's hush. "Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation, dozens, all dismissed or buried." She detailed incidents, each a thread in a pattern of abuse, from unwarranted stops to violent encounters, all shielded by a system that valued loyalty over justice. "This wasn't oversight," she said. "It was complicity." The gallery held its breath, her words a hammer striking the foundations of Hayes's defense. Jurors scribbled furiously, their faces a mix of shock and determination. A young juror, his eyes wide, seemed to grasp the systemic stakes, his notes a quiet vow to act. Carla's testimony wasn't just about Hayes, it was about a department that had failed to hold him accountable, a betrayal of the public's trust. Clara presented Carla's reports, pages stained with the ink of ignored truths. "These documents show a pattern," she said, her voice resolute. "They show why Marcus Carter stood here, slapped for daring to exist." The jurors absorbed the evidence, their expressions reflecting a growing resolve to confront the system's failures. An older juror, her face stern, nodded, her pen pausing as she internalized the moment's weight. Officer Hayes sat diminished, his eyes avoiding Carla's. Her testimony was a spotlight he couldn't escape, illuminating choices he'd made, orders he'd followed. A memory surfaced, a warning from Carla years ago, a chance to change, ignored. Had he dismissed her, or had the system emboldened him? Leonard Walsh rose, his voice faltering. Detective Evans, aren't internal investigations often inconclusive, given the complexities of policing? He asked. Carla's gaze was unflinching. Complexity doesn't hide truth, she replied. It demands we seek it. The gallery murmured in agreement, a tide of support that Walsh couldn't stem. Judge Grayson maintained order, her eyes reflecting the trial's broader stakes. James watched Carla, recognizing a fellow truth-seeker, a woman who'd risked her career for justice. His FBI work had taught him the cost of such courage, and here, he saw it bear fruit. Marcus, beside him, felt the weight of Carla's words, his silence amplifying her truth. This was a fight for every voice silenced, a stand for a system that served all. As Carla stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Spectators shared nods, their unity a force of change. A man in the back whispered, "This is it, the truth's out." His words captured the room's spirit, a reckoning dawning, a promise of justice rising. Marcus and James stood ready, their bond unbreakable, as the trial neared its resolution. The courtroom stood on the precipice of resolution, its air charged with the weight of truths unveiled and the promise of justice realized. Marcus Carter, the 17-year-old whose defiance had ignited this trial, stood as a symbol of hope, his silence a powerful testament to a resilience that had inspired a community. The prosecution's case, led by Clara Bennett, had dismantled Officer Richard Hayes's defenses, exposing a system that had failed to hold him accountable, and now, the verdict loomed. James Carter, Marcus's father, sat with a quiet strength, his FBI-honed instincts attuned to the room's collective breath. The jurors had deliberated for hours, their faces now a mosaic of solemnity as they filed back into their seats. Judge Eleanor Grayson called for order, her gavel a gentle tap, her eyes reflecting the gravity of the moment. The gallery held its breath, every spectator a participant in this historic reckoning. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a steady gaze, rose, holding the verdict. In the matter of the assault on Marcus Carter, she began, her voice clear, "We find Officer Richard Hayes guilty of misconduct and excessive force." The words landed like a thunderclap, a ripple of gasps and murmurs spreading through the room. Justice, long deferred, had spoken. Marcus stood motionless, his heart pounding but his face composed. The verdict wasn't just for him, it was for every young person who'd faced suspicion instead of support, every community that had demanded change. James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of pride and solidarity, their bond a beacon in the storm of emotion. Together, they had faced a system's flaws and emerged stronger, their dignity unyielding. Clara Bennett exhaled, her face a mix of relief and resolve. The verdict was a victory, but her work, and the community's, continued. The jurors, their duty fulfilled, sat with a quiet pride, their decision a testament to their courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Spectators rose, some embracing, others wiping tears, their unity forged in the crucible of this trial. Officer Hayes sat slumped, his badge a tarnished symbol under the courtroom's lights. The verdict was a mirror reflecting his failures, a call to reckon with a path that had led him here. A memory surfaced, his first day on the force, a vow to serve, now a distant echo. The road to redemption, if it existed, would be long and arduous. Judge Grayson spoke, her voice measured but resonant. "This verdict is a step toward accountability," she said. "But it's only a beginning. Let it remind us that justice demands our vigilance." Her words were a charge to the room, a call to carry this moment beyond these walls. The gallery nodded, a collective vow to see change through. Outside, the media swarmed, cameras capturing the crowd that had gathered, their signs proclaiming, "Justice for Marcus" and "Reform Now." The verdict sparked conversations across the city, from coffee shops to community centers, a wave of dialogue that promised to reshape policing and trust. Activists like Jamal Robinson and Rosa Nguyen stood among the crowd, their voices amplifying the call for policy changes, training, oversight, community engagement. James stepped forward, addressing the room one final time. "This isn't just our victory," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of his FBI experience and a father's love. "It's yours, every person who stood with us, who believed in a justice that lifts us all. Let's carry this truth forward, into our streets, our laws, our hearts." Marcus, beside him, felt the weight of his father's words, a mantle of responsibility and hope. His silence had been his strength, but now, he spoke, his voice soft but clear. "Thank you," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "For seeing me, for fighting with me. Let's keep going, together." The gallery erupted in applause, a chorus of unity that echoed beyond the courtroom. "Thank you, friends, for joining this journey, for witnessing a story of courage and change. But the work isn't done. I urge you, carry this tale into your communities. Speak out against injustice, support those who fight for equity, demand systems that honor every person's dignity. Together, we can build a world where justice isn't a dream but a reality, where every Marcus finds a voice, and every community rises as one. Let's make this verdict a beginning, not an end, and walk boldly toward a new dawn of truth and unity."